Hello, what am I doing? I'm sorting out a few books I've got from Egypt, a country. Now, you know where Egypt is. Hmm. What have I got? I've got one on the ancient lives, the story of the pharaoh's tomb makers. I've got one on Egyptian medicine in the days of the pharaohs. The monastery of St. Catherine from when we visited. And the story of the Copts. What? Sorry, pardon? What's a Copt? A Copt is an Egyptian Christian. Where do they come from? Egypt. Are they a new group? No. In fact, some of the earliest groups of Christians there are. One of the oldest churches, the Coptic Church, that we have in the world. Who started it? That would be St. Mark. Do you know who St. Mark is? Would you like to know who St. Mark is? Who is St. Mark? Okay, St. Mark, also known as John Mark, which is his actual name, to be fair, so we call John Mark Mark, so that we don't get confused with the other John who wrote the Gospel of John, because John Mark wrote the Gospel of Mark. So there were two Johns. Yes, maybe 3 or 4 Johns, but John Mark wrote the Gospel of John, so that we don't get him confused with the other John who wrote the Gospel of John. We call him Mark. Now, John Mark came from a very wealthy family from an area called Cyrene, which is in modern-day Libya. One day, nomads came through the area and raided the place and stole whatever valuables they could. And sadly, John Mark's family lost everything. They moved to Jerusalem, and from Jerusalem, obviously John Mark ends up meeting Jesus. We don't know exactly when he met Jesus. We believe that he was at the wedding feast in Cana, when he turned the water to wine. That's your favourite bit of the wedding Cana story? Okay, are you finished? Okay, so we do know that he was the man who carried the water to the house where the Last Supper took place. We also know he was one of the 70 disciples who was sent out by Jesus, when Jesus sent out the 70 to go and proclaim the good news of his kingdom. Then, after the death of Jesus, he hosted the disciples in his house. So they came and stayed there. That's where they were hiding last week, when we talked about the locked room when Thomas wasn't around. And Jesus appeared, yes. So that house where the disciples were hiding, it is also the house where Jesus appeared, and it's also the house where the Holy Spirit comes down upon all the disciples at Pentecost. That was John Mark's house. Mark then goes off and travels and shares the good news of the resurrection And at one point, the Holy Spirit calls him to go back to Libya, where he was from, and share the good news in northern Africa. And then from there he goes to Egypt, and one of the biggest cities in Egypt at the time was Alexandria. And he was amazed as he wandered around that city at just how great it was. And as he passed by a store, there was a cobbler who, the last minute, dropped what he was doing and cried out, "Oh, the one God!" And Mark uses that as a pretext to go and help him. He quickly grabbed some clay, spat in it, wiped it over the wound because the cobbler hurt his hand, and he was healed. And from there, Mark talks about Jesus and who this one God really is. Very quickly, many people in Alexandria came to want to hear the good news of Jesus, and it wasn't long before Mark, though, needed to leave. He essentially becomes their first bishop, and he leaves behind Anianus to be the bishop of Alexandria. So he consecrates Anianus as bishop and makes 12 disciples, ordains 12 disciples, sorry, 12 priests, not disciples. Yeah, they are really disciples of a bishop in many ways. Yes. And he makes 7 deacons, so that there is a bishop, 12 priests and 7 deacons, and he travels off. Ultimately, though, he comes back to Egypt, and the church has grown exponentially. What does what mean? Exponentially means it grew very big. I can keep talking. Okay. And all of these new Christians wanted him to write down the story so they could have the story from his mouth. The eyewitness stories, the important stories, the gospel that shared the stories of the good news. And so he wrote his gospel account. Sadly, it was close to Easter time, and so they had a big celebration, but it also happened to line up with a pagan event, festival, and they got quite offended that the Egyptians, Coptic Christians were celebrating the Easter resurrection, and they grab Mark, tie a rope around his neck and drag him through the streets. And throw him into a prison overnight. There, he has a visit by Jesus, and Jesus tells him to not worry, and that the next day he would be getting the crown of martyrdom and would be welcomed into God's heavenly kingdom. The next day they once again threw the rope around his neck, dragged him back through the streets, and they dragged him so hard his head came off. Yeah. And that way, Mark, not John Mark or Saint Mark, ended up with 3 crowns. He had the crown of discipleship, crown of evangelism, and then the crown of martyrdom. That's why Saint Mark was quite an important individual, and without him, we wouldn't have large parts of the church or stories of the faith, and for many people, they wouldn't even have a gospel to proclaim. Yes, he was very important. Can you read this book now? I suppose.